I like swords. Did you know that? And another earth-shattering revelation, I like variety. You never would have known if I hadn't told you. Some swords more than others, maybe. So, I'll try a top 5 list, which is difficult because I like too many things. So, narrowing it down is a bit of a challenge. Number 5 for me is the Egyptian Khopesh. It's such a unique design and very early on in the history of swords. Obviously, ancient Egyptian craftsmanship is famous for a reason. Some are particularly elaborately shaped and decorated, and it's just such an iconic sword. I mean, so many people, even if they aren't into swords, they've probably seen a Khopesh, either actual historical ones or some iteration in video games or movies. People have described its unique shape in a number of ways. Some saying it's sort of like a sword-axe hybrid, which I wouldn't really agree with, and some calling it a sickle sword, even though a sickle has its edge on the inside and the Khopesh has it on the outside. Am I being pedantic enough yet? And this is a tribute to my appreciation of the Khopesh and the Kriegsmesser. It's a hybrid between the two. And this is something that I think could have existed in history, particularly in the Renaissance when they often look back. There's nothing that would prevent this from being effective other than maybe the weight. This one in particular turned out a little clunky. The nice thing about this is that it has such an aggressive curve that you can get very powerful slicing cuts out of it. But at the same time, with the way it's shaped, the point is still generally in line with the hilt. So it could still be used for thrusting, even though it's so wide that it's not as effective for that. It's such a cool design. You know, like the Khopesh in general, not just this. The number 4 spot is also largely an aesthetic choice, although I don't doubt its effectiveness at all. And that is the Kris sword from the Moro people of the Philippines. The Kris as a dagger, the Indonesian form, is well known. You've probably seen it before. And this is the larger sword version. And there's a lot to appreciate about it. The wavy blade, of course, is very iconic. How much more effective an undulating edge is compared to a straight one, if at all, is debatable. I've discussed that topic with Matt Easton before. The video is linked in the description if you haven't seen that yet. But it's not just the blade. There are a number of fascinating features that the Kris has, such as the tooth-like cutouts in the guard. Overall, it's clearly infused with profound cultural meaning that I don't fully understand, but can still appreciate visually, if you will. Then at number 3, speaking of wavy blades, a particular form of greatsword or Zweihander. This is just a foam version, but as a prop, it'll do. What can you say? To me, this is the f*** you sword. I mean, the audacity. Basically, they looked at pole arms and were like, yeah, but I want a sword though. This was not a direct counter to pikes and pole arms in a Fire Emblem weapon triangle sort of way where this always beats that. It was not quite that simple. These swords were also used alongside pikes and pole arms in the same formation. But they definitely competed with pole arms quite directly, and it was risky business, hence the double pay. And as I said, it's basically audacity in sword form. Big and bold, kind of edgelord, kind of like, hey, look at me, I'm so different, that sort of thing. But it works, and it has a legitimate use as well. I don't know, as modern day geeks and nerds, I think we can feel a kinship with the craftsmen of the day who basically took the rule of cool, which didn't exist, maybe it did, who knows, and said, you know what, we're gonna make it work practically. It's gonna be super badass, and it's still gonna be functional. Except when it wasn't, because it was a ceremonial sword intended for parades, not for actual fighting, when they went a little crazy. And sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish what was intended for use and what was just a show-off sword, literally. The second place, silver medal, if you will, in my list of favorite swords goes to basket-hilts. In general, I don't mean specifically the Highland basket-hilt broadsword, but basket-hilted swords in general. There's plenty of different versions. I'll narrow it down in a moment, but this is mainly for 2 reasons. One, sheer pragmatic effectiveness. They had finally figured out how important it is to keep your hands safe and prevent your fingers from being lopped off in a sword fight, short of wearing an actual gauntlet. And they removed it as a target entirely by enclosing the hand in steel. There's a lot to be said about it. The handling generally is quite good because it's well balanced. You can have a fairly broad cutting blade that is quite powerful in that way, but still have the balance be relatively far back. And second, the craftsmanship is so impressive. When you look at these at museums, they're awe-inspiring. It's just such intricate work, bars curving every which way, wrapping around, often elaborately decorated as well. They're not just weapons, they're art as well. Anyway, it's a broad category, so I'll narrow it down to two: a double-edged and a single-edged version. For the double-edged, in my book, you can't beat the Venetian Schiavona. It's such a beautiful design. It encapsulates everything that's great about a basket hilt and makes it even prettier. My friend Eric owns a reproduction that also handles remarkably well and is a joy to cut with. And for the single-edged version, I'm going with a Dussac or Sinclair hilt saber. You can argue this is functionally double-edged because it has a sharp false edge, and that's the part you cut with anyway. So I would even argue it gives you the best of both worlds. It gives you that double edge where you need it, but you still have a blunt spine to work with for parries or even striking with a blunt side. This one here handles better and I like it more overall. It's just a very short blade. I would appreciate a little more reach, but either way, it's a very nice sword. At first I wanted to have a Messer on the list as well because it's so underrated yet such an effective design, particularly for civilian everyday carry and self-defense. But this does everything the Messer does and more, so it's just Messer plus. It has to win. And on the number one pedestal, to no one's surprise, is the Spadroon. No, it's a longsword. I mean, I always like two-handed swords more. It's just that for every two-handed sword, there are like 10 single-handed swords in history. It's not an exact number, don't quote me on that, but there are generally a lot more single-handed ones. And yeah, not this in particular. I like something way fancier, like I talked about in the video about the height of sword evolution. 16th century long swords with complex hilts are the cream of the crop to me. Essentially everything I said about basket-hilted swords also applies here, except that you sacrifice some hand protection for control. Because your hands can't be quite as safe. You can't encase the entire hilt to the point where both hands are equally safe. Well, you can, at least on one side, but the more you add, the more you restrict what you can do, and the heavier it gets. There are more options. You have a greater variety of techniques you can use when you don't have that extra hand protection, but they still went that extra mile, particularly as said in the 16th century. They elevated the craftsmanship to new heights. And in terms of functionality, there's just so much good to say about it. I've harped on about versatility over and over again. Like if you were either in a hypothetical historical situation where you have to arm yourself, but you don't know what's coming, you could be facing who knows what, or as an adventurer in a fantasy world, again, you don't know what you might encounter. I think it would be very hard to choose anything more versatile than that. Sure, you can go for the old sword and board combination, whether it be, you know, a full-size shield or a targe or a hook shield or some, you know, offhand parrying weapon or whatever. That is a good choice, no doubt about it. And you could make a case for that over longsword, but I can't stress enough how much you get out of using that extra hand on the sword. You know, like every technique you can use becomes more efficient and more precise and more powerful and more stable in case of defensive actions with that extra hand. I'm including the Kriegsmesser in this as well because functionally it is a single-edged longsword. You use it the same way and everything that applies to the longsword does here as well. And you know how much I like this sucker. It can be a little tricky to distinguish longsword and greatsword. I mean, what is this? It's too big for a longsword, but it's not quite that crazy size. I would generally say that a longsword can still be worn on your hip in everyday life without being a huge inconvenience. I mean, it is an inconvenience, and it's definitely worse than a shorter sword like a Messer or Dussac that you can wear much more comfortably, but it's still doable, whereas greatsword, not so much. Lancelot's Red Baron is also right in between. Can you wear it? Yeah, not conveniently, it would definitely get in the way. But this you can't wear on your hip at all. You would have to carry it like this. And that's it. I'm not even going to bother with honorable mentions because I like too many things. The list would be too long. What's the point? Let me know what your favorites are. Hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching.